Hi, I'm David Ordonez, and I'll be talking about environmental justice in Catholic social teaching. I'll go into the brief history of the term, its relevance to us as Catholics and even Jesuits, real life scenarios in which people's rights to equitable access to environmental resources have been violated because of their identity or other social, economic, or political factors in their lives that they cannot control, initiatives that are being taken to combat these injustices, and what we can do on a local level as New Yorkers. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. The goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection and environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. When there is discrimination of people because of their identities or social and political factors that they cannot control, then there is an environmental injustice. In an, in an environmentally just community, all people have equal access to resources like food. Everyone is treated equally under the law, and no communities are disproportionately affected ecologically by hazardous waste. The greatest issue with environmental injustices is that it is not an immediately obvious form of discrimination. It is important to recognize that these issues are a part of a larger systemic problem. It has roots in our country's racism, homophobia, xenophobia, and all other forms of discrimination that are more subtle and not as explicit. Marginalized communities have grown into the system of constant oppression that intersects with all aspects of their lives, placing them in a state of complacency because they do not realize that the violations infringe on their basic human rights. As inhabitants of this planet, it is our responsibility to uphold equitable access to healthy living in our environments with no exception. As Catholics, we are particularly called to do so. Following the basic tenets of Catholic social teaching, we are called to work for environmental justice. We must uphold the dignity of the marginalized communities who are being subjected to inhumane ecological conditions that they cannot control. This dehumanization that removes the dignity of people cannot be allowed to continue. The poor and low income communities are particularly vulnerable to climate hazards and lack of food accessibility. As Catholics, we are called to uplift and empower the poor, not just by acts of charity that can temporarily sustain them, but working towards systemic change that permanently removes the barrier that prevents them from fair treatment. Industrial communities are also subject to environmental injustices because they live in the same area as factories that cause pollution and hazards. The working class's dignity must be upheld because their labors sustain our communities. Governments must take responsibility for their role in perpetuating a system in which people are environmentally disadvantaged. However, they must allow the people to address these issues by empowering them so that the change be made communally, just as koinonia is a facet of Jesus' preachings. Overall, Catholics are called to stand in solidarity with all people who are discriminated against because we are all God's children. We must all work for the common good of justice for all God's creation, be it humanity or the plants, trees, oceans, and the rest of the environment. In his encyclical, Pope Francis, notably a Jesuit pope, notes that the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. We cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. In fact, the deterioration of the environment and of society affects the most vulnerable of the planet. The impact of present imbalances is also seen in the premature death of many of the poor. Pope Francis recognizes the need as Catholics to strive for an environmentally just world because, as he says, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. As Jesuits, we seek cura personalis, or care for the whole person. To achieve this, we must work towards establishing environmental justice to allow all people to fully flourish as God has intended. The most infamous event of environmental injustice in recent American history is the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Historically, in the 20th century, Flint was the birthplace of General Electric Motors. It had a flourishing environment of around 200,000 people who were employed by the booming automobile industry. The 1980s, rising oil prices and auto imports resulted in shuttered auto plants and laid off workers, many of whom eventually relocated. The city found itself in decline. Flint's population has plummeted to 100,000 people, a majority of whom are African American and Latino, and about 45% of its residents live below the poverty line. Flint has a $25 million deficit, so it fell under state control. Governor Rick Snyder of Michigan appointed an emergency manager to oversee and cut city costs. This precipitated the tragic decision in 2013 to end the city's 5-decade practice of piping treated water for its residents from Detroit in favor of a cheaper alternative, the Flint River water. Although the river water was highly corrosive, Flint officials failed to treat it, and lead leached out from aging pipes into thousands of homes. A study conducted the following year by researchers at Virginia Tech revealed the problem. Water samples collected from 252 homes through a resident or organized effort indicated citywide lead levels had spiked, with nearly 17% of samples registering above the federal action level of 15 parts per billion, the level at which corrective action must be taken. More than 40% measured above 5 parts per billion of lead, which the researchers considered an indication of a very serious problem. In Flint, nearly 9,000 children were supplied lead contaminated water for 18 months. Flint's water supply was plagued by more than lead, though. The city's switch from Detroit water to the Flint River coincided with an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease that killed 12 people and sickened at least 87. The third largest outbreak of Legionnaire's disease recorded in the U.S. history, as well as the discovery in 2014 of fecal coliform bacteria in city water, was likely a result of the city's failure to maintain sufficient chlorine in its water means to disinfect the water. Ironically, the city's corrective measure, adding more chlorine without addressing other underlying issues, created a new problem: elevated levels of toxins that cause cancer that are byproducts of the chlorination of water. This blatant case of negligence in a neighborhood that is majority low income and has around 70% black community is what makes this environmental hazard an environmental injustice. However, while Flint is the most popular case in the United States, it is not the only instance of environmental injustice. In Louisiana, for example, so called Cancer Alley is an 85-mile stretch of land along the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge that's lined with oil refineries and petrochemical plants. The location got its sinister name from Cancer Alley because residents of the area are 50 times more likely to develop cancer than the average American, and those who live there are predominantly black. In Florida, the sugarcane farmers legally set their fields on fire prior to harvest in order to burn down everything but the cane, resulting in major amounts of pollution hitting predominantly poor black communities. In 2015, a study funded by the U.S. Education Department found that residents of the Glades who are exposed to pollution from sugar field burning experience a greater amount of respiratory distress, and, and locals have complained of suffering immune systems and an increase in asthma. Studies have shown that Black, Latino, and low income California residents are also more likely to live near oil and gas wells that spew toxic pollution, and people of color are more likely to live among power plants, oil refineries, and landfills. So, what does this environmental injustice look like in our world? Statistically, in the US, low income communities are more likely to be exposed to climate change threats such as flooding, storms, and droughts due to inadequate housing and infrastructure. Indigenous populations that rely on subsistence farming practices for food have limited options for adapting to climate change threats. When urban areas were developing across the country, zones reserved exclusively for residential purposes were often expensive. Meanwhile, mixed-use zones were more affordable but allowed residential and industrial buildings to be built side by side. This led to a higher population density in areas closer to environmental hazards. Residents of environmentally degraded areas do not or cannot move because of a lack of financial resources or ownership of current land. Environmental justice also recognizes food accessibility, or the lack thereof. In 2018, 11.1% of U.S. households experienced food insecurity at some point during the year, reducing their access to adequate food for an active, healthy lifestyle. Food prices are higher and quality is lower in high poverty areas. In 2018, the average U.S. household spent 14% of income on food, while low income families spent over 13%. Hispanic and Black children have higher obesity rates than white children on average. In 2015, about 54.4 million people, which is around 17% of the total US population, had low access to a supermarket due to limited transportation and uneven distribution of supermarkets. A case study in Detroit found that households in poor Black communities were on average 1.1 miles farther from a supermarket than in the poorest white neighborhoods. Negative environmental factors can compound social and economic conditions and lead to higher levels of chronic health problems such as asthma, diabetes, and hypertension for minorities and low income communities. And recently, due to long-standing inequalities in living, working, health, and social conditions, minorities in the US are 4 to 5 times more likely to be hospitalized from COVID than non-Hispanic white persons. LGBTQ youth already make up 40% of homelessness in the US, while climate change continues to misplace more and more people as natural disasters increase with climate change. 1 in 5 LGBTQ Americans live in poverty. This poverty rate is guaranteed to increase while facing the effects of climate change. On an international scale, the World Health Organization estimates that climate change will cause an additional 250,000 deaths per year between 2030 and 2050. Though wealthy, developed nations like the US emit larger amounts of toxic waste per capita, developing nations experience the worst effects of climate change relative to wealthier countries due to their limited resources and ability to adapt. A study following a flood in Nepal in 1993 found that the greater mortality rates of women were due to discriminatory practices in the distribution of food and medical attention, as humanitarian aid prioritized men. The study also showed that women were more likely to face environmental injustices due to heat waves and malaria epidemics associated with rising temperatures that will only increase. The government has taken certain steps to remedy the issue. In 1994, President Bill Clinton signed an executive order for all government organizations to create strategic plans to address environmental justice and outline the consequences for failing to consider possible environmental injustices. As of 2020, the Environmental Protection Agency's Environmental Justice Program has granted over $28 million to community projects and organizations in over 1,400 communities, focusing on clean air, healthy water, land revitalization, and environmental health. Recently, President Biden intends on holding corporate polluters responsible for rampant pollution that creates the types of underlying conditions that are contributing to the disproportionate rates of illness, hospitalization, and death from COVID-19 among Black, Latino, and Native Americans. He has established an environmental and climate justice division within the U.S. Department of Justice. He has built on President Clinton's plan and elevated environmental justice in the federal government and modernized the all of government approach. Biden will elevate and reestablish the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council, both reporting directly to the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. These two councils will be charged with revising Clinton's executive order in order to address current historic environmental justice in collaboration with local environmental justice leaders, and they will be tasked with developing clear performance metrics to ensure accountability in the implementation of the executive order. Internationally, the United Nations has established sustainable development goals in order to allow developing states to flourish while empowering the communities who have disproportionately been ignored. They recognize how women and LGBTQ plus people have historically been denied equal access to a healthy environment. While these initiatives are great, they are reactionary. These resemble acts of charity that simply provide aid to communities after they have suffered, instead of focusing on the underlying issues that causes the system to perpetuate the injustice. As Catholics, we are called for the government to step back in order to allow the affected communities to enact changes themselves. Change, however, is difficult at a national level, so we must start small, at a local level. In a city as metropolitan and diverse as New York, there are many opportunities to be involved in initiatives for change through grassroots activism groups. Historically, communities in New York City who have been redlined are subject to more hazardous environmental conditions. These minority and low-income communities have higher rates of asthma, and their food system tends to be more expensive on average. Organizations such as Uprose is Brooklyn's oldest Latino and Black community-based organization. They describe themselves as an intergenerational, multiracial, nationally recognized community organization. Uprose, Uprose promotes sustainability and resiliency in marginalized neighborhoods through community organization, education, indigenous and youth leadership development, and cultural and artistic expression. Central to their work is advocacy to ensure meaningful community engagement, participatory community planning practices, and sustainable development with justice and governmental accountability. As lead advocates of climate justice, as lead advocates of climate justice, Uprose views the just urban policy, ranging from transportation to open space, as the heart of climate adaptation and community resilience. Grassroots activism seems to be the most effective way to enact change. Getting involved in a communal movement in which the voices of the people are uplifted and all are educated on the issues is how to combat environmental justice and stop it from being as pervasive as it is in the world.